Einstein said in every difficulty, in the middle of every difficulty, there's a genuine opportunity. So I think today fits, all right? But I'm a fan of the old Charlie Chan detective movies. I remember him saying one time, even smart man sometimes mistakes Bumblebee for Blackberry. So I don't think we'll have that trouble today. Anyway, just a bit of my background for those who don't know me. George Vincent. My mother grew up in a ranch in the valley. Her ranch was the oldest out there, 1870. It's still out there. It's the mooring ranch today. She was one of 6 children, was born on the ranch. She attended the old Pinole School here like most kids did in town. She also ended up teaching at the old Pinole School and then in the basement here of the Methodist Church when after World War II there was an overflow of students. My mom also worked at the shell factory in World War I to put herself through San Francisco State. First teacher, first college graduate in her family. She loaded artillery shells during World War I. Dangerous occupation. My father was Portuguese. My mother, by the way, was Irish. I should mention that because she would, you know, when I visit the gravesite, have some say about that. My dad was Portuguese. His family were town's business people. His father ran a saloon, Charlie Vincent Saloon. They lived on Hernandez Avenue. My grandfather bought a lot from the Tennant family for $150, built his home, Queen Anne style, which is still on the end of Tennant Avenue today, Hernandez Avenue today. And my father's families both ran saloons. My dad's family also ran a saloon across from Fernandez Park called the First and Last Chance Saloon. So I come from a Portuguese-Irish heritage. I go back to the 1940s and 1950s, my memory. Don't ask me what I did last night. Don't ask me which side of the bed I got on this morning. Okay? Most of what you're going to hear today is true. Most is factual. Some is hearsay, but some is fun say. Just to give you an idea, if you grew up in Pinole, which I did, it was a one-horse town. It was a truly one-horse town. When Pinole was incorporated in 1903, September 25th, population 665. 150 male citizens voted for incorporation. 6 voted against it. No women could vote then, unfortunately. After World War II, 1950, the population had increased to a whole 1,147. Not much of a change. World War II veterans came back, found Pinole just like it was in the past. Hadn't changed. By 1969, there were 13,000 people living in Pinole and 1,000 new homes on the hills around Pinole. As a kid, we used to go into these hills looking for mushrooms in the winter. That ended when the boom came and the subdivisions came into Pinole. And in 1958, the freeway came through and divided Pinole. This town, Old Town, was not always the Old Town. Pinole had 3 distinct parts. The Embarcadero, or the bayfront, that was Pinole's first downtown. The valley ranches, the hinterland of Pinole, Pinole, by the way, was always an agricultural community surrounded by ranches and farms. The downtown did not grow until about the turn of the century and just a little before the turn of the century. There were reasons for that. But you had the hinterland, the valley ranches, you had the downtown, and then you had the bayfront, or the Embarcadero, where the Fernandez enterprise was. I might say that Pinole, the geography of Pinole and the landscape always attracted people to Pinole. In 1882, Slocum's History of Contra Costa County described Pinole this way. The little hamlet on the pebbly beach of San Pablo Bay, situated by the mouth of the beautiful valley by the same name. And that pretty much said everything about it. In 1929, the Chamber of Commerce got Pinole's first slogan. So if you don't know the town motto, it's Pinole. Sun-kissed Jim by the bay. And for those of you who knew Mrs. Jordan, a famous teacher on the old school in Pinole, she was the one who won that slogan contest in 1929. I might mention about the geography of Pinole because you have to know a little bit about Pinole's history to understand what we're going to do today. We are not going to have as long a tour as we had last time. We focused more on the residential homes before. Today we're going to focus quite a bit just on the businesses. So I just want to say a couple of things that everything in Pinole is built on the bones of something else. There is very little left of the old town, the charm of the old town, the history of the old town, and we're trying to preserve what is left. Hopefully someday the Frio home, which was moved here in 2005, will become a museum, but that's just a dream right now. Pinole's geography attracted the Indians, the Native Americans who lived here. The whole downtown was an Indian mound. There was a large number of villages, the Hutuan Indians who lived here, and Native Americans who lived here at that time. And it wasn't until that was the prehistory of Pinole. In 1872, the Pedro Fages Spanish expedition came through Pinole deep in the valley and encountered the Indian tribelets living there. The Indians gave them a mixture of corn, seeds, things like that, and the Spanish had only one word for it, Pinole. So they called it the place of Pinole. That's how Pinole got the oldest name in Contra Costa County, the place of Pinole. So the Indians that lived in this area became servants and laborers on the ranchos when the Spanish came. The last mention of a Native American Indian was in the 1890s at the Adobe Ranch deep in Pinole Valley. An Indian boy shot an eagle, supposedly with a wingspan of 8 feet. And that was the last mention of a Native American. But they became servants. Even the tenants had Indian servants in their home as late as the 1860s in Pinole. But to understand where we're going, I have to give you a little historical background. Don Ignacio Martinez was granted 18,000 acres of land in 1823 for his 40 years of military service on the Spanish and Mexican frontiers, most of it without pay. He had 11 children, 9 girls and 2 boys, and they lived in the adobes deep in the Pinole Valley, about 3 miles from here. He also had a boat on the bay, a redwood boat, which he would take to go to the San Francisco Presidio, where he was commandante. His daughter, Rafaela Martinez, the 7th daughter, was born at the Presidio of San Francisco. The reason I mention her is when the old Don died in 1848, his estate was divided up. Now, the area we see here, Rodeo, was where he had 13,000 cattle and 1,000 head of horses, plus sheep and other farm animals. Grizzly bears abounded in this area. The last grizzly bear was shot in 1842. It dressed out at over 500 pounds. The bears would come out of the hills when the rancheros would kill the cattle in Rodeo, the place of the roundup, which that's how the place got its name. That's where the roundups were held and the cattle were killed. Then the hides were treated, the fat was boiled off, and they would cart them by ox cart all the way to Point Pinole, where they were put on Yankee trading ships, and the Yankees would trade them for things they needed, like toothbrushes, metal objects, and so forth. Okay, the people the Spanish that lived in this area and the Mexicans had very, very little to work with and live with, so they had to import just about everything. So I mention that because when he died in 1848, his estate was divided up among his 11 children. Rafaela Martinez got all of this downtown and all of the waterfront as her inheritance. Very choice property. In 1848, Samuel Tennant came to this area from Hawaii, Dr. Samuel Tennant, an English physician, looking for gold. He got no further than Pinole Valley. He met Rafaela Martinez, fell in love with her. They were married in 1849, and the rest is history. The first wooden home and wooden ranch was out here where the bowling alley is today. That was the Tennant Ranch. They had 10 children. Rafaela passed away in August 25th, 1864 at the age of 44, leaving Samuel Tennant with a young daughter, 3-year-old Anna Tennant, to raise. Now, the reason I mention that little bit of background is because this area, the Tennants divided into blocks and lots and sold it off. So you really didn't have a downtown here until the late 1890s and 1880s. Pinole didn't really take off. I'll tell you in a few minutes, why it did. One thing I'd like to mention is we're near Pinole Creek. Water was always important to the people of Pinole. They never had enough of it. And that's why Pinole didn't develop as fast as it could have. Now, the Indians, of course, always located their villages near fresh water, and Pinole Creek was an ideal source for that. You still have steelhead trout running up Pinole Creek every year, just like they did way back then. A friend of mine a few years ago fished out a 25-pound steelhead with a rake. So during the winter time, there's still steelhead runs and salmon runs up this creek, believe it or not. And this creek has always been important to Pinole. Late 19th century, the 1860s and 1870s, Pinole had no water. They just had well water, which was pretty alkaline, not very good. The creek water, okay, but you had to boil it, and don't forget the outhouses overhung the creek. You also had everybody throwing their garbage and dead animals into the creek, hoping that when winter came, it would flush everything out into the bay. Time after time in the 1820s, there were signs saying you will be arrested if you're caught throwing anything into the creek. Most people had what are called cisterns, holes in the ground to catch rainwater, or rain barrels to catch rainwater off the roof. In fact, the old-timers used to say the water was so scarce, they had to use it 3 times. The first time to bathe in, the second time to wash clothes in, the third time to scrub the floors with. That's how scarce it was. Now, it wasn't until 1904 when the Hercules Powder Company put in a well and a pumping station. In 1898, they bought the hill. I don't know if you've seen the flag flying above that high hill near the bowling alley. That's the old reservoir up there. In 1898, that was dug out. It took 2 years to do it. They dammed up Pinole Creek. This was the Hercules Powder Company. And the water was pumped up into the reservoir. Now, for the first time, Pinole and Hercules had an adequate water supply. And that was the first time we had water. And that's when the town really started to boom, because we had water. Electricity, that came later in the first part of the 20th century. First sewage system about 1929 here. The road here, Highway 40, it used to be called before San Pablo Avenue. Many of you remember that. It used to be only wide enough for 2 wagons to cross. Remember, this was a dirt road. There's Pinole Creek. You have to have a bridge over the creek, don't you? Wooden, rickety bridge. When Bernardo Fernandez drove his cattle from Rodeo to Pinole to put on the train, they often would collapse the bridge and the cattle had to be shot. The other bridge, when Pinole goes down by Collins School, the white bridge there, that was the other crossing. Very rickety also. When Samuel Tennant drove his cattle to the bay to be put on the trains, they would collapse that bridge quite often. The bridge you see here was put in probably in 1939 during the Works Progress Administration during the Depression. I might say that the first gas lines were also put in during the Depression, so Pinole had gas and electricity. Thanks to E.M. Downer. You're going to hear that name quite often. Mr. Downer brought electricity to Pinole. He brought water. He was the one who was instrumental in getting Hercules to build the reservoir. He brought the post office to Pinole. He brought the Mechanics Bank to Pinole. He gave his soul to Pinole from 1898 to 1938. He was the mayor of Pinole. He was on the board of trustees. He started the Pinole Light and Power Company. There were 3 movers and shakers in Pinole. Samuel Tennant, he was the one who owned all this land here. In the 1850s, he sold the waterfront to Bernardo Fernandez, who developed the waterfront. And Fernandez became the mover and shaker and chief entrepreneur on the south side of Pinole and developed the bayfront, developed enterprise there to bring the grains and the hays from the valley, to bring the cattle from the valley, load them on ships, ship them to San Francisco, ship them to Santa Cruz, Monterey, and all ports beyond. So in the 1880s, Pinole was a thriving town, but we didn't have a downtown like this. So that gives you a little bit of background of this road here. In 1865, the Martinez to San Pablo stagecoach would come through here. Again, it was just a dusty 2-lane road. But that gave some recognition to Pinole because Martinez was a big town there, San Pablo was a big town there, and you had to pass through Pinole. So Pinole started to gain some recognition, a little bit of growth. We're in a very historic area. I call this the second four corners because this area was an area that grew up, businesses grew up here, but in second position to the real four corners where we're going to end the tour down here. And that's where the big saloons were. Okay? You didn't have too many saloons here. You have to understand that Pinole and Hercules had a symbiotic relationship. Hercules had workers with money, single most of them, and nowhere to live and nowhere to spend their money. Pinole had saloons, hotels, boarding houses, places for young guys to spend their money, and it had the stores also. So, speaking of stores, this home across the street, by the way, you can trace Pinole's history through its architecture. This is not an architectural tour, but I will give you a few bits of information about the architecture of the town. This home is the Charles Clark home, built in 1895. It's a classic example of what was called Queen Anne architecture. The front porch, the steep gables, the bay window, the gingerbreading in the front, the fancy trundles and spindles and so forth. It was owned by Charles Clarence Hall, and Clarence Hall built the square deal garage here in 1928. But remember what I told you, what was here was built on the bones of what was here before. The square deal garage was once the Pinole Meat Market. This garage was owned by Chet Hall in 1928, the first garage to work on automobiles. Before that, the blacksmith shop, which is down where the Park Blue Plaza was, that's where you worked on cars. That was the first car repair place in Pinole, the old blacksmith shop. Charles Clark owned this grocery store, this building that you see right here. In 1901, he ran the grocery store here. Now, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, this was Glenn Ellis's grocery store. Before that, in 1911, Charles Clark sold this grocery store to Joe Lewis. Now, Joe Lewis is a member of my Portuguese side of my family, and he held the grocery store for many, many years. I'll give you an idea of, here's one of the ledgers from then, how much something cost. Joe Lewis, dealer in groceries and provisions of all kinds, orders delivered to all parts of the city by horse and buggy. All you had to do, no telephones by the way, they delivered to your house back then. Okay. 3 loaves of bread, 16 cents. For 3 loaves of bread. All right. Tobacco, pack of tobacco and corn, $2.60. So these are the kind of things that we know what was being sold and for how much in Pinole. We don't have too many of these things left. Now this building is, as I said, when I was a kid, they would not let us ride our bicycles to the old school up on the hill in Pinole. So we had to leave our bicycles down here. Okay? And by the way, no one stole them then. We didn't have to worry about that. But what's funny is this was Glenn Ellis's store in the 50s. Then in the 60s, it was Mickey's Bait Shop. Now, Mickey had a parrot in the back, and every time you came in the back door of the bait shop, the parrot would squawk so he knew somebody was coming in. Well, the kids up at the old school in Pinole in 1966 would kick the ball down the hill on purpose. Ask the teacher, can we get the ball? Yeah, hurry up. Well, it'll go all the way down Valley Avenue, roll almost over here, then run over to Mickey's, run in the back, the parrot would start yelling, they'd buy candy, run back out, get the ball, take it up the hill again. Teachers never caught on to that little trick. I just want to point out these 3 homes over here across the street. Those are Queen Anne homes also. Queen Anne homes were popular in the 1890s in Pinole, up until the turn of the century. The first one is the Stats home, where it says law offices. Beautiful example of Queen Anne architecture and the gingerbreading and the porch. The second one is the home of Jerry Macdonald. Now, Jerry Macdonald was constable in Pinole in 1929. He was killed, machine gunned to death during a bank robbery in Rodeo, okay, by a gang of notorious bank robbers. And the third house is the only Queen Anne home in Pinole that has a turret. Today it's called the Captain Cottage. When I was growing up, it was called the Man House. My first job in Pinole, first job I worked at Hercules. My first job in Pinole was a paper boy. $12 a month. I had 65 customers. I had all these homes you see up in here, all around here, all the way down the bay, all the way up the Summit Drive, all the way back in the old town of Pinole and so forth. And I probably made at most $5 or $6 a month. Okay, but I loved it. Okay, Richmond Independent. Way back then. Yeah, that was it. By the way, let me tell you the life cycle in Pinole, because it was very important that you understand that the population didn't increase very much because people didn't leave Pinole. I was afraid to go outside the city limits. No kidding. I started shaking when I got to the city limit side and came back because I knew someone would call my mother and tell, he's over here. He doesn't belong here. Everybody looked out for everybody's kids back then. You grew up in Pinole. You were born and brought into the world by Dr. Emmanuel Fernandez. You went to school at the old school in Pinole, up that hill there. It was built in 1905. It was ready for occupancy in 1906, but the earthquake prevented it. I went there from kindergarten through 8th grade. And in September of 1906, after the earthquake, the school opened. But everybody in Pinole went to that school. If you got there early enough, you were lucky enough you could ring the bell, the school bell, which we still have, by the way, the only thing left. It was torn down in 1968. The building you see here is the Second Methodist Church, built in 1925. Notice it's built of brick. Pinole used to burn down all the time. It wasn't until in the 19-teens and the 20s that they started building things of brick to prevent fires so much from happening, because Pinole used to burn quite often. So you went to school. You were brought in the world by Dr. Emmanuel Fernandez. You went to school in the old school in the hill. You met your girlfriend there, your sweetheart there. You married your sweetheart, okay, from Pinole. You worked at the Hercules Powder Company. That's where you worked. My dad worked there. I worked there. My first job was cleaning bricks, 5 cents a brick. Okay. Then, the last part of your life, Charlie Ryan, the undertaker from Richmond, used to drive around. The old guys used to be sitting on all the benches here, and Charlie would wave at them, and they'd kind of cringe. So your cycle of life, you're born into the world by Dr. Fernandez, you went to the old school, you worked at Hercules, you were taken out of this world by Charlie Ryan, the undertaker. Now, the home that we have here, this is Blanche Woy sitting in front of this home. It's a Queen Anne home, a small Queen Anne home. This home was built in 1906, okay? And the building you see here with the State Farm on here, that was the Woy Bakery. The Woys came to Pinole from Pennsylvania in 1906. And this is the first home delivery by automobile in Pinole. Try to get Trader Joe's to go to your house today. Just to point out another home of interest before we go down the road a little bit, just to the left of this house here was Al Corn's skating rink in 1913. So we had a outdoor roller skating rink. Today it's a vacant lot. But the teachers used to take the kids on special trips, field trips down to the skating rink or to the movie show. So it was a fun time for them back then. Here's the old school as it used to look. At the time, it was the most beautiful architectural school building in Contra Costa County. I just might mention, I was custodian up there for 4 years at night when I was going to San Francisco State. The first custodian night man quit because there were ghosts in there. I laughed at him. No, there were. I just learned to get along with them because they needed the job. They were, I think they were children. They're just playful. They slam doors on you. You know, hear footsteps running up and down the halls. This is the Reitz Theater. Now the Reitz Theater, as we go up the street, is where, right as you cross the creek, was where that first building is, where Tom Gazzano's real estate, old-time real estate is. It was run by David Herscher, who was a brother of Abraham Greenfield's wife, who we'll talk about later. My dad remembers going to silent movies here. There was a lady, he said, playing the piano for you. How much? Under 12, 5 cents to get in. 12 to 15, 10 cents, 15 and above, 15 cents. And Pinole had this movie theater for a great many years. And you would see Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Lillian Gish, Fatty Arbuckle, you know, all the greats of the silver screen early times. That home, which houses the Pinole Creek Cafe today, was the Pfeiffer home. But in 1874, it was built. It's one of the oldest homes left in Pinole. It was the John Boyd home. And John Boyd was a blacksmith. He and his wife, Catherine, had a daughter, Susie. When John Frazier came to town, who owned the blacksmith shop, John Boyd and John Frazier worked together in the blacksmith shop, and John Frazier married John Boyd's daughter, Susie, just to show you how people married their next-door neighbors in Pinole. You didn't go too far. When George Pfeiffer took over the house in 1900, he was a carpenter at the City of Hercules. He remodeled it all and put a bay window in the front. Now that was early type of architecture. In the 1870s, all of Pinole buildings, residential dwellings, had evolved from farm buildings to what were called Italianate hip roof homes, which had narrow windows, porches, and up at the top, they had a fence around the top of the roof in New England style, like Cape Cod style. That was all the rage back then. But George Pfeiffer took it off the top of the roof, and he remodeled the house. Now, George Pfeiffer married a girl named Lottie Race. She came to Pinole in 1898, got off the train. She went to the dance at the Opera House, met George Pfeiffer, who was a single bachelor, and they got married. So a lot of happy love stories in Pinole. All right, we're going to move finally, so your feet aren't rooted. We're going to move down the road here to past what I showed you as a Reitz Theater. Now we're going to stop where the Alibi Saloon used to be, the famous Alibi Saloon. By the way, now, turn of the century, Pinole had about 6 residential homes along here. That was one of them. And about 13 to 20 saloons. Pinole was a heavy drinking town. Okay? It was a horse and buggy town. Lots of horses. Citizens complained all the time to the city council about horse droppings everywhere because of all the saloons and the horses tied outside. On one occasion, one of the horses even went into the saloon, dropped dead there. Okay. That would be a good name for that saloon, the Drop Dead Saloon. Just a word before we cross the creek. Pinole Creek used to flood all the time. Worst flood 1916, second worst 1940. Last and greatest flood here was 1958. San Pablo Avenue was a river, so was Tennant Avenue. It was something we had to live with. I remember a boat tying up on our front porch across from Fernandez Park. Okay? It rained for 6 straight days in April and the high tide came in. After that, flood control came in the 1960s. What you see is a cement-lined creek. Used to be beautiful creek, lined with beautiful trees, bushes, native vegetation. That was our playground, was the creek. Now, my dad got typhoid fever from swimming in the creek at age 14 and almost passed away. So, because of the sewage was dumped into the creek also. But it was the only playground we had at that time. But in 1960, in the early 1960s, the flood control came in, the Army Corps of Engineers widened it and deepened it so Pinole has not had a terrible flood as we did since then. In the old days, the wooden sidewalks used to float out to the bay during flood time. This is where the theater was here, the Reitz Theater. This is Hernandez Avenue. Most streets in Pinole are named after early residents. Where we were before, you had Samuel Street, named after Samuel Tennant, John Street, named after his brother John, Dr. John Tennant, Rafaela Street, named after his wife Rafaela. Hernandez Avenue is named after Bernardo Fernandez, whose son was Manuel Fernandez, who delivered me and everyone else in town. Bernardo came here in the 1850s, developed the Embarcadero. That'll be another tour another time. But his son Manuel had an office in one of the brick buildings we'll see that's gone down there on the corner. Now this corner was a saloon. My grandfather, Charlie Vincent, ran the saloon, and his home is down end of Hernandez Avenue down here. This was the corner, this was the Alibi Saloon. After my grandfather, Charlie Vincent's saloon, he sold it. The Alibi was built here. It was not taken down until the late 1970s. It was a very, very popular saloon in Pinole. Mike Lewis ran the saloon. I remember one time there's some heavy drinkers. The regulars, always regulars at every bar. The Antlers, the Alibi, they were very faithful to their, watering holes. One time, this guy comes into the Alibi and asks where the University of California was. And Emmett Walton, a guy named Pulley Walton, all guys had nicknames in Pinole. Pulley Walton because he always pulled on his pants. Squeaker Silva because he squeaked when he talked. Spoon Silva because he's always messing with spoons. Skunky Cardoza, you go on and on and on. But anyway, he came in and asked where the University of California was, and Pulley Walton said, you go out and it's up that hill, Samuel Street, to the old school on the hill. The guy never came back. But the Alibi Saloon had something that was very unique among all saloons in Pinole. It had beautiful booths, a beautiful bar. It also had a restaurant addition here with Chinese food. But the men's restroom inside had a beautiful lady in a ball gown sitting on the commode. But it was a mannequin. And she looked real. And if you had a few drinks and didn't know she was in there, you would walk in and all of a sudden her arms would go up with the toilet paper and it looked like she was getting off the commode, and the guys would come running out. I mean, you just bought a drink to watch newcomers go in and just come out. It was really classic. She disappeared, and I found out last year she was at a thrift store in Nevada City for $400 for a year. By the time we found this out, she'd been sold. But she provided a lot of entertainment for people. Here's a 1958 flood, and here's the Alibi. This is what it looked like in 1958. The building here, which is now the Paris Street Bistro, was Louis Rouffe's store. It was built in 1914. It was built of brick, and you can see it here where the Greyhound station is. It was also the Greyhound bus station. It was one of Pinole's first brick buildings because everything else burned down, and they learned a lesson. Pinole did not have a fire department, so Hercules in 1904 put in a well and a pumping station because the Yellow Horse barn burned down, and they had a bucket brigade of 75 men. They couldn't save the barn, so they figured it's time to do something. So the Hercules came in, put in 6 hydrants for Pinole, bought a 500-foot cart with hose that the volunteer firemen pulled. If it wasn't for those men and that hose and those carts and those hydrants, the whole town would have gone up 4 years later. This is Louis Rouffe, his grocery store, standing out in front of his store. Louis died in 1954. I learned to read by sitting in his store there and reading his comic books. And I would get kicked out all the time. Mel Marcus is the other grocer there with him would kick me out because he said, "You're going to buy anything, kid, get out of here." You know. But what's interesting about Louis Roof's store is that you also had the telephone exchange there. Now, our phone number was 133, I remember that. My post office box number was 33. So our phone number was 133, and you'd have to go through the operator in Louis Roof's store. On the top of the store was the fire siren. If there was a fire, you would call down to Louis Roof's store, and they would summon the volunteers by setting off the fire siren on top of the roof. The building was destroyed by the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. Here you see on the right, that's the Downer building, which is gone now, next to the bank. It was next to the bank, built of brick in 1916. Dr. Manuel Fernandez had his offices upstairs. Downstairs was a drugstore and a fountain. And that's where we kids hung out. Triple-decker ice cream cone, 25 cents. Suicide Cokes, if you remember that name going way back. Okay, as we get Suicide Cokes. And Good-Hearted Sally, who was the waitress there, she let all of us kids buy things on the tab. I don't think she ever got paid, but she was good-hearted to all of us. So that was the Downer building. It, too, was destroyed by the Loma Prieta earthquake. It was made of brick and it came down in 1989. The building in the middle we'll walk by as we go to the Four Corners. You can see that's the Mechanics Bank. That's the second bank of Pinole. To the left, you can see Louis Roof's store. And then to the left of that, you can see the old saloon that was here before the Club Alibi. By the way, the Club Alibi was also known as a gondola. If your memories go way, way back, the Gondola Saloon. Why was the Alibi torn down? As far as I know, it was just sold. Mike Lewis and his partner decided it was time to sell. The building was old, and it belonged to Valpera, I believe, the Valpera family. And so they sold it, and it was demolished. A lot of Pinole's history has been demolished. Across the street, that's where the Fraser blacksmith shop was, over there. And that's where, of course, John Fraser will show his house. John Fraser's home was right in the middle of where those cars are parked. Beautiful home, built in the late 1898. By the way, cameras did not come into vogue until 1903 when the Kodak company invented the box camera. And those were expensive. Unless you had money, you couldn't afford it. It was like a Camry, a Lexus of its day. The only photographs we have before that were posed by commercial photographers or taken in the town for postcards. Here's the Bank of Pinole across the street in an old paint store. Edward M. Downer moved his bank to Pinole. He started the Bank of Pinole in a building right there that's gone now. It was a paint store, one story, old wooden building. That's where it all began, 1905. Now, I didn't talk about the Downer home because that's another story, but as you go out of Pinole to the east, you look up on the hill, you see the Downer mansion up on the hill. Edward M. Downer built that in 1900 for his wife Elizabeth Downer. She was a great worker in the Methodist Church. In fact, the Methodist Church was dedicated in her name in 1925. And it's a great example of classical revival architecture. And a beautiful home, and Don and Linda Bartels have lovingly restored it. And thank goodness for people like them that have saved so much of Pinole's history. So this is the first bank in Pinole. Easy to rob. Now we're getting into the saloon area of Pinole. Okay, you know, this is the Alibi. Before that, it was another saloon. I don't know what my grandfather called it, just Charlie Vincent Saloon. That's all I know it was called. And they had a butcher shop there before Louis Roof's store was built. This is Manuel Marcus, another Portuguese entrepreneur, businessman, saloon. Portuguese were big in going into the saloon business. Manuel Marcus had his saloon where today the Bear Claw is. That's one of the oldest remaining buildings in Pinole. This was before the turn of the century. Manuel Marcus had 8, he bragged he had 8 sons. And he said, I'm going to have one more, I'm going to have enough for a baseball team. And he had a daughter. The 9th one was a daughter. He also owned the old commercial hotel, 40-room hotel where home plate is in Fernandez Park right now. And that's where some of the ladies that the gentlemen from Hercules were entertained by were. 50 cents a night for a room. I won't say any more about that. Where the Bank of Pinole number 2 is here that we'll pass in a couple of minutes, that was built in 1915 by Edward M. Downer. Fancy bank. Has Ionic Greek columns, classical revival Greek architecture. It was the only building not to be knocked down by the 1989 Lower Parada quake. But before the bank was there, the Pinole Hotel was there. And here is a Pinole Hotel. 1901, run by Mrs. Sullivan. They usually had an Irish lady running most of these boarding houses. You could get a room in a hotel in Pinole for about $22 a month, 50 cents a night or 25 cents a night, meals at all hours, didn't matter. Now, this was the finest hotel in Pinole. It burned down in 1909. Most of these buildings in Pinole were wood. Most were close to one another. They're made of redwood, but they were very close to one another. And when there was a fire in one, it just spread very quickly, and fire control was not that advanced in Pinole then, and especially at nighttime if there was a fire. The Bank of Pinole was built 6 years later on the site of the old Pinole Hotel. So when we go by the Bank of Pinole there, just remember that used to be the Pinole Hotel. Edward M. Downer now, remember I told you he was one of the movers and shakers in founding Pinole, one of the big 3. I would say more the modern time Pinole, he was very instrumental in developing. He moved the bank here in 1915. It had marble floors inside. I remember as a kid it had palm trees inside, a big marble drinking fountain. It was just a gorgeous, gorgeous building for its time. And fortunately now it's one of the 2 buildings in Pinole in the National Register of Historic Places. The Bank of Pinole, number 2, and the Fernandez Mansion down by the bay. Those 2 places. This is Pinole in the 1930s. On the right, you can see the Downer building where it says drugstore, Greenstein's drugstore. Then in the middle, the Bank of Pinole. Then Louis Roof store. So that's how it looked in the scene in the 30s.
We're laughing at X-Lax.
Right, X-Lax, it was a big thing back then.
We needed it.
Yeah, it really got you moving. Mr. Downer in 1919 bought the controlling interest in the Mechanics Bank in Richmond, and his family run and operate the bank until this day. He had 2 children in the home on the hill outside of Pinole, but his grandchildren, children, and grandchildren continue to run the bank today and are benefactors of our Historical Society. We're very grateful to them because so much of Pinole's history is attributed to Mr. Downer. He passed away of a heart attack in 1938, and you can see why. He was on the Board of Trustees of the first school district, Pinole Hercules School District. He founded the Pinole Light and Power. He brought water to the city of Pinole. He was came in 1889. He was the first postmaster in Pinole at the Southern Pacific Station. He was a telegrapher. He founded Pinole's first newspaper in 1894, the Pinole Weekly Times. And on and on and on and on his credits go. And he was mayor for some 38 years in Pinole. Ladies and gentlemen, we're lucky we have with us this morning Tim Banuelos, City Councilman, and he is the architect of this vacant building lot here. Now, when I was growing up, this was a Shell station. When it caught fire in the 1950s, I remember we thought the whole town was going to blow up. Okay? But Before that, it was Mcguire Saloon at the turn of the century. Would you like to?
No, you're doing good.
Oh, all right. I didn't know if you had any architectural. What's going to be here?
Oh, for right now, this is it.
This is it. All right. This is what we have. Open space. This was Mcguire Saloon. This is a historic Four Corners in Pinole. Downtown Pinole did not develop until the 1890s. Late 1880s, 1890s, during the Victorian era. Why did it develop? Because Edward M. Downer moved the post office from the depot, the Southern Pacific Station, the Bayfront, to the downtown area. Over where those cars are was the building. And that was the post office downtown. And other businesses began to follow. Okay. One of the chief businesses in Pinole was Greenfields department store. Now you see it there, it's the Alley Cafe in the bottom. That was 3 stories. It had a cupola on the top. It was called Pinole Bazaar. In 1897, it was built. People in Pinole changed in 1879 drastically because the Northern Railroad, which later became the Southern Pacific Railroad, came in to the Bayfront. And when they came into the Bayfront, the California Powder Works soon followed. So you had an industry here in Hercules. Lots of people came into Pinole to live. The population really increased. And the downtown started to grow with businesses and lots of saloons. And this area became known, the litany of the 19th century, late 19th century, was the Four Corners. And you try to get as close to the Four Corners as you could for business purposes. Mcguire Saloon was here. Across the street, where those brick buildings are, again, those are brick. Those were built in the 1920s. There was a large Victorian bar there called the White House Saloon. But the Nunes family tore it down and built the brick building in the 1920s. Greenfields department store. People in Pinole went to Smith's Cash Store in San Francisco to get the supplies of groceries. They went by train because there wasn't any place in Pinole really to get that much. Smith's Cash Store in San Francisco was like the Costco of its day. Okay, you got a discount. They would ship 3 or 4 months worth of supplies back to Pinole via the Southern Pacific Railroad. This road here was called Tennant Road. It was a dirt road. It wasn't Tennant Avenue, it was Tennant Road, named after the tenants. Remember, the tenants owned all of this land. Their orchards extended way up here. That's why we have prune, plum, peach, and pear streets, because all of those orchards are all through here at the time. Anyway, Greenfield store came in 1897. People could shop in Pinole. They delivered to your home. Anything you wanted, Greenfield had. From liquor to buggy whips, to ice, to coal, you name it, you went to Greenfields to buy it, and it was delivered to your house. He also took you to court if you didn't pay your bill. He was in the business to make money. Okay? And Mr. Greenfield's brother owned the bakery down there at one time. I want to show you this picture. Try to imagine cattle being driven up and down Tennant Road. The cattle would get off the cattle cars in the Southern Pacific, down by the bay. Cowboys would drive them through downtown Pinole, out to the ranches in the valleys. I remember when I was 5, the cattle being in our backyard, across from Hernandez Park, and the dogs barking, and the cowboys yelling, and the dust everywhere. And I was scared. I was small then. For those of you who are counting the numbers, I was very small then. So Pinole was kind of a Wild West place for a long time, until 1945, when the city council said, hey, no more cattle coming through Pinole. People are complaining too much. You want to grow up a little bit. But this is what it looked like. And then on the way back, the next year, the cattle would come back from the ranches, fattened up to be put on the cattle cars. Again, we have a question. Whatever happened to the old playhouse? Now, for some of you who don't know, there's a beautiful children's playhouse right next to Roof's brick store, where the Pear Street Bistro is. Louis Roof built that for his stepdaughter. Wagner. I can't think of Katie Wagner was the mother. The daughter's name was Wagner. I can't think of her name, but he built that playhouse for her. And we always looked in the windows. It had all these rich kids' toys in there. I think Don Connick's, one of the developers in Pinole, I think when he tore that building down, I think he took it to his home. At least that's the story I heard. But that Barbara, her name was Barbara Wagner, yes. And that was her playhouse. Here is Greenfields Building. This is a Holy Ghost parade during the summer in Pinole. Every summer, during the Feast of Espiritu Santo, the Holy Ghost parade was held. Pinole Band was always the first in line at the parade, as you can see them here. They're here at the four corners. Every parade went through the four corners here. If it was any kind of a parade, a 4th of July parade, a Fiesta del Pinole parade, which we no longer have, and of course the Holy Ghost celebration parade. Now I want to call your attention across the street here. This was the direction south. The southeast four corner. Over there was the southwest four corner. This is the Macdonald Brothers Haberdashery across the street, where they sold all men's clothing and menswear of all kinds. It was right where you see that sign says public parking sign there. Now the post office was just to the left of this. And when I was growing up as a paper boy, the Valentine Cleaners was there, and kids all folded our newspapers there, the Richmond Independents, before we delivered them. And that's where the independent fellows would drop off the papers for us. Just as an aside, the Thursday paper was the heaviest paper. One day I was delivering to the mayor of Pinole, Ward Fagerberg. He lived up on Summit Drive. I was in a hurry, I had my bicycle. I threw the paper, the wind caught it. It went through his window. Not just the window, the pane too. Took out everything. And of course, he informed my parents I had to pay $38, and so that was it. But anyway, that was my first experience with the mayor of Pinole. So this is Macdonald Brothers, and notice the horses. We haven't changed to automobiles yet, but that's coming. On the corner there was, built in around 1890s, was Jimmy Silva's Golden West Hotel. And you can see it right here. Beautiful picture. Dog lying in the old street, in the dirt street. There's the post office on the left, and Jimmy Silva's Golden West Hotel.
Just a pump house now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can see in the distance a horse and buggy going down to the depot. Probably someone getting on the train. Now, Jimmy Silva's Golden West Hotel was a beautiful building. It was torn down in 1958, unfortunately. Before that, it was the Travator Cafe. In the late 1940s, Joe and Maria Lunghi ran an Italian restaurant there. People came from all over. The cars were just jammed everywhere trying to get into that restaurant. They had booths and curtains and tables. It was a wonderful place. Later on, the Golden West Hotel, as it was called, and the Travator Cafe, as it was called afterwards, later on it became another saloon. This is one of the most famous pictures in Pinole. The Antlers Tavern is right here. That is the famous Antlers there, but at one time it didn't look like that. It had a cupola. I want to show you this one. This house was in back of what is today's Tina's Place. It was built in the 1870s. It's a good example of the Italianate hip roof architecture. It's gone today. It was torn down in the 1970s. I took this picture in 1976. But just to show you, even in the 1970s, we still had a lot of old architecture left in Pinole. So Queen Anne architecture style came after the Italianate hip roof architecture. On Valley Avenue are the 6 Brandt Cottages. Carolyn Brandt built them in 1906. The architecture there developed into the residential form out of the Queen Anne. So if you ever go down Valley Avenue, there's 6 homes there. Those homes built by Carolyn Brandt in 1906. She hired a local contractor to do it. Those homes represent the architecture that came after the Queen Anne. Next to the Antlers was Forester's Hall. Now this was a social hall where people in Pinole gathered for dances and lodge functions. At the turn of the century, lodges were in vogue. You belonged to the Masons, the Foresters, the Woodsmen, Knights of Pythias, the Redmen, the Pocahontas, the Eagles. Everyone belonged to a lodge, but the function of the lodges originally, they helped people in need in the community. If you were sick, they took care of you. If your children were ill or needed to go somewhere, the lodge took care of you. So lodges were very important, and Forester's Hall on the left here was built upstairs, lodge functions, downstairs it was, dances and social gatherings. Forester's Hall now, in 1908, Pinole had its worst fire ever. The Murphy House, which was right next to the current Antlers, caught on fire in the middle of the night. The caretaker lost his life, but somehow the Antlers was spared. It's a lucky saloon. The Murphy House burned down. The Forester's House burned down. John Collins' Klondike Saloon, next to that, burned down. The whole town almost burned down. The volunteer fire department just saved the whole town with their quick efforts. But somehow the Antlers survived. Next to it is the American Hotel. This was built after the fire. It burned down in 1929. But again, another first-class hotel on the 4 corners. You had to get around in Pinole. Pinole had a livery stable. The livery stable was right behind Tina's place, behind that house I showed you with the hip roof. In 1900, it was called Bradhoff's Livery Stable. Fine horses, stylish rigs, they advertised. Okay? Then it was taken over by the Walton family that you see here. It was Pinole's taxi service. When you came to Pinole, you came by the Southern Pacific Station. Walton's taxi was there to pick you up, rain or shine. And when you left Pinole, you left by the station depot, Southern Pacific, down by the bay. Walton would take you back down then. So this is Walton's livery stable, the way to get around in Pinole. This is a beautiful picture we just received this year from the Antlers Tavern. This was taken around the turn of the century. You can tell because you see the fire plugs. Those were put in 1904, so it had to be taken a little after that. You see Pinole had electricity. Pinole Light and Power, thanks to Mr. Downer. On the left, you see the Antlers as it used to look around the turn of the century. The Antlers has had many different owners and has been remodeled many different times in many different ways. But it's always remained the #1 saloon in town. It's where I got my first drink when I turned 21. Okay? Martini. I'll talk a little bit more about the Antlers itself inside the building later. Across the street, you can see the White House Saloon. Victorian style building. You can see why. They're all built of wood and close together. How dangerous it was. Most people had wood stoves, by the way, and they were very dangerous. And they were very unpredictable. Where did they get the wood? They got it at Hercules at the box factory or shake factory. Pinole residents would go down there, pick up the scraps of wood from the dynamite boxes, bring them back and put them in their stoves. And sometimes they'd go away and forget about their stoves. And this is the 4 corners going down the dirt road. But you see the transition? There's an automobile now for the first time, from horse to automobile, going down Tennant Avenue toward the depot. We are probably now going, I believe, to the Antlers, correct?
Yes.
You know, I'm sorry I haven't fielded questions. I've tried to give you some information just about the businesses. Last time we focused on the residential or the homes, and we hope to vary the tour each time a little bit different. But if anyone, again, cares to make a donation to our society, again, we'd appreciate it. But I do appreciate all of you coming and your interest in the history of this town, because it's a little town with a big history and a very rich history. And remember, it's the oldest name in Contra Costa County. And some of you are thinking that, how old is this guy? You know? My mother used to say, I'm as old as my nose and younger than my eyes. So that's where I'll end the tour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
People that came here said that also it was patronized by Jack London on his way up to Martinez, where he wrote a lot of his books. So Jack London sat at the same bar you're sitting at. In 1961, I got my first drink here, over there in the corner. I got a martini. Red Lefevre bought it for me, and I fell off the stool. I might call your attention to the outside of the saloon. Every saloon in Pinole had a bench on the outside for the old-timers to sit on. And it was here where the old-timers sat, watched women who were pregnant to see which foot they put first up on the curb. If the pregnant lady first put her left foot up, it was going to be a boy. If she put her right foot up, it was going to be a girl. Just to give you a little more background on the Antlers, the outside has changed a great deal. You used to have a cupola on the outside. The architecture has changed. It almost burned down in 1908. By some miracle, the hotel next door caught fire, but the Antlers was saved. The Antlers has had a great number, many owners. One of the first owners was Jack Squeaker Silva. Jack Silva had an interesting hobby. This was in 1910. He loved to collect animal heads, animal trophies. You can still see some animal heads in here today. At one time, this bar was full of bear heads, moose heads, deer heads, mountain lion heads, full-size deer in the window. In 1910, it was also called the Swenson and Lewis Hotel. Andrew Swenson lived and Manuel Lewis owned the bar at that time. The bar changed ownership. In the 1940s, Frank Lungi bought the bar. Into the 1950s, Frank's brother Joe was the bartender, and this bar turned into a working man's bar. Every worker from Hercules came here after work to drink. The beer was the coldest draft beer in Pinole. The two most popular saloons were the Antlers and the Alibi, the two A's they were called, Antlers and Alibi. But here's where the rugged and the rough crowd came, to the Antlers. They were on the walls all over the saloon were pictures of sports memorabilia of all kinds, boxers, baseball. This was a working man's bar. And the two signature dishes were the crab and shrimp cocktails. They were the best. People came from all over the county to get the crab and shrimp cocktails. In 1976, the bar was sold to the Toretta family, and it's remained in the Toretta hands ever since. It's one of the most historic spots in Pinole, certainly one of the most noisy spots in Pinole, and it will always be a popular watering hole. Once more, I'd like to thank the Toretta family for hosting us today and providing all this wonderful food and entertainment. So, thanks so much.
History in Pinole is part of like your society, and I think that for the most part, without it, we're just another community. So I applaud them very much. Thank you very much. Real short on the history of the Antlers, I'm sure as far as, you know, how old this place has been, I get asked a lot over the past couple of years is, how long has this building been here? Well, in brief, in the early 1880s, you can see a picture with a horse and buggy over here that shows this building with an old Victorian look to it. It had a little steeple on the front of it. And in the 1930s, because this was the thoroughfare for the route from San Francisco to Sacramento, that because it needed to be widened because the area was growing, this building was actually lifted and moved back. And unfortunately, I've crawled underneath this building enough times to tell you that I think they just guessed on how wide the foundation needed to be. After it was moved back in the 30s, of course, we had Prohibition. This place was one of the many speakeasies. I don't know if many of you know about a speakeasy, but the reason why they called bars speakeasy because of Prohibition, you couldn't serve alcohol. So they said, shh, when you're having that whiskey with your lunch, you wanted to make sure that you didn't say too loud because the police might find out. Well, the police really in many jurisdictions knew that many of the places were serving alcohol. This one of the many. But in 1938, this lady, Lucille Dalmaso Caparetta, started the Antlers, its name. That was after in the 1800s, as George pointed out, that it was Swenson and Lewis as it's the first tavern. So going back to when they moved the building back, they changed it. When you look at it now, you go, is that the same building? But you can notice the same windows that are in existence. They just cut off the little gingerbread hut on the front of it. If you notice here up on this picture, and they have it down here. And they put stucco on the outside of the building, and that's probably what's preserved the building for this long. The stucco has actually kept it together. So Lucille sold the place. There's been several owners since then. But kind of gets to my family and history is my mom and dad started in business in Pinole in 1960 in the old Pinole Food Center. And how this place became owned by them is I think my dad was at the check stand with Frank Lungy, who was the owner at the time, and said, or his wife came in and said, we're looking to retire, would you be interested in owning a bar? My dad, being a long-time grocer, said, I don't know anything about the bar business, but sounds good. Over the course of time, he ended up buying the bar, and it needed a lot of work, as it does on a daily basis. I can attest to that. This old rickety building, as many who've been in here, the floor ebbs and flows with you. You know, in fact, if you're dancing on this side, you might fall into a hole. But it's, you know, the best thing about this business for the most part is got a wonderful group of customers that are, you know, I think Mississippi calls it, it's like a 4th-generation bar. You know, we've got, you know, the history of families that have been in Pinole that have brought their 21-year-olds in to kiss our moose. Many memories for a lot of families, and I think probably on top of great servers. I mean, Mississippi, how many years you been here now? Mississippi, 22 years. Johnny, how many? 10. I've been here 23 years. My father passed away suddenly when I was in college, so we've got longevity. Terry Shaner, my other bartender, he's been here 22 years, so and I think we all stick around because we're a tavern. It's a place where people meet, you know. And I think we get, you know, a lot of times you'll get a, you know, black mark. Oh, it's the bar. You know, we're the social hall. I mean, for many events. And today, as you say, not just the Pinole Historical Society, but we have a memorial for a celebration of life for a Pinole citizen. So the Antlers serves a lot of purposes, and I think for the most part, we enjoy being here. And I want to say once again, thank you so much for the Pinole Historical Society and my mother.